This is a complex industry. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of players involved. There's a lot of layers. When I talk about what we do, I always say we're part of a transportation cocktail. And having spent so much time in the agency space, part of the money that was wasted by engaging with an agency, that's not specific to an industry was they have to get up to speed about your industry. And listen, if they're saying they're not billing you for that time, that's bullshit. You're going to pay for it some way or another. If it's during the pitch, you're going to pay for it afterwards. You will pay for that time.
Welcome to the eMobility Marketing Podcast, the show where we talk to people shaping the future of electric transportation and explore how marketing can help great ideas scale faster. I'm your host, Theo. Today, we're diving into the story of Clover, a fresh player in the e-bike world with a subscription model, zero maintenance for riders, and battery swaps at the tap of an app. My guest is Scott Murphy, Clover's founder and CEO, and someone who's believed in the power of marketing from day one. We've worked together since Clover's very early days, so I've had a front row seat to how they've built their brand from the ground up. In this episode, we'll talk about why marketing should never be an afterthought for startups, the choices Scott made in Clover's early days, and how those decisions are paying off now. So Scott, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Before we get into Clover's journey, I already know some of this, but for our listeners who don't, how did you end up in the e-mobility space?
That's a good question. It's kind of a long way around the barn, to be honest. I think probably now is a good time to say that I spent most of my career in the advertising business. So marketing, advertising, brand building, all of that. But mobility, something I've always been interested in. I got my pilot's license before I got my driver's license. It's always been something, just how people get around, how people move, and particularly kind of in densely populated urban areas. So I would say my first jump into it was a startup called OpenAirplane, which rented airplanes to pilots no matter where they lived. So if you, for example, live in Chicago, you've got your pilot's license in Chicago. If you wanted to go to Milwaukee, for example, and rent an airplane, you would have to go through a complex check ride, all this kind of stuff. So we created essentially a universal check ride that allowed people to get checked out in their hometown and then rent at any of our rental locations around the country. So there's something like 3,000 airports around the US that you could rent from. After working with them in kind of in an advisory role, we launched a new product called Fly Auto, which paired planes and pilots with passengers on demand. So I hate this term, but it was kind of Uber for airplanes.
Right.
And it used latent charter supply that was available in the US and connected those charter operators with new customers. And we could talk endlessly about the brand building that we did then at that time for that brand. And then after leaving there, did a lot of independent consulting in the kind of mobility space, particularly around go-to-market strategy, that kind of stuff. And then joined the team at Revel in New York. So Revel, when I started, was on-demand electric mopeds. So you had an app. There were, by the time I left, around 7,000 mopeds in the four main boroughs of New York. You could jump on, ride kind of wherever you want, park as long as you were within the zone. And it was a super easy, convenient way to get around the city, a great way to get to the beach. And, focused a lot there in particular on kind of the operations and operations management side of things, and just loved it. I mean, I loved every part of it. Eventually, Revel pivoted away from mopeds and launched their ride hailing and became a charge point operator. So they were, at the time, the largest single charging station in Brooklyn. They had 25 RTM 175 chargers. And so at that point, I left. And we can talk more about Revel too, because a lot of even more exciting things happening with those guys now. I left Revel and briefly ran for New York City Council. It was kind of a crazy idea. I thought, I wanted to change the city for the better. I had all kinds of interesting ideas, a lot of them around eliminating private car ownership. And did that, didn't win. I kind of knew I wasn't going to win, but it was a very good learning experience for me. And I really got to know a lot of fellow New Yorkers, and particularly in my district. And then, kind of fast forwarding, I co-founded a startup in London called Fin, a last mile logistics startup using micro fulfillment centers in the center of cities, in this case, London, and using large scale electric cargo bikes. So these are wheeled large cargo bikes. They weigh about 250 kilos. You can fit another, some of them up to 300 kilos of cargo in the back of them. And the idea of that was you bring in goods like things like, TikTok shop from a warehouse in the outskirts of the city. You bring it to the city center in a large truck, unload that into the micro fulfillment center. and then distribute that using the cargo bikes. So a lot
Mm.
more efficient. And again, taking vans off the road. Left that in November of 2023 and eventually moved to Valencia, Spain. Co-founded Clover here in Valencia, and we'll talk more about it for sure, I'm sure. But
Yeah.
our mission at Clover is to enable two-wheeled electric mobility with unlimited battery swaps. So yeah, that's how I got where I am now.
And did you actually move to Valencia for starting Clover, or was there another reason why you moved there?
It's a good question. I always say, do you want the investor answer or do you want the real answer? No, there's a little bit of both. Valencia, I moved here because my family is here. My sister, my mom, their kids, all of that are all here. But it happened, and I knew from the start that Valencia is, I like to call it a transportation utopia. Number one, I mean, it gets named, most recently it was named by Forbes as the number one place in the world to live,
Mm-hmm.
and regularly is number one in other top 10 places to live in the world. So there's that. But if you take a step back and look at the infrastructure in Valencia, it kind of combines all of the things that you want when you want to do a mobility startup, right? So you have positive interest from the government. That's always super helpful because usually that's number one challenge when it comes to mobility, and they're super supportive. But then you have the infrastructure. If I wanted to start this in New York, yeah, I probably could because of just the sheer volume of people. But from a logistics and infrastructure perspective, Valencia is, again, top in the world for cycling infrastructure. So we're talking about over 400 kilometers of dedicated bike lanes and a cycling culture, that are number 7 in the world for cycling to work. So it made sense, outside of, yeah, of course, my family is here. That makes it a little easier to move. It definitely made sense as a place to go for B2C mobility startup.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like being Dutch, I'm kind of used to the cycling culture as well. So, and I can imagine in a city like Valencia, it's even better with the weather being warmer and sunnier. So, yeah, it must be a great place
300
to,
days of sunshine, you can't beat it.
yeah, really good. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
Scott, like, how did the idea of Clover start to take shape? Like, was it based on your own experience? Were you missing something in the city, or did you have that idea already in mind when you moved to Valencia?
No, when I came to Valencia, I knew I wanted to do something in B2C mobility. I didn't know what. Drawing on all of my experience from mopeds, I was very focused on a moped idea.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things you'll see when you come to visit Valencia is there's already 4 moped operators in Valencia, which again is another reason why it's kind of a transportation utopia. If I'm not near a Cultra, I can pick up a Yigo. If I'm not near a Yigo, I can pick up a Cabify. If I'm not near a Cabify, so it kind of was a bit saturated already for mopeds. And coming from London, I had spent a lot of time and kilometers on Lime, which is obviously dockless shared e-bikes. And one of the things I learned was you can't count on Lime as a daily commuting option. I did it. It was a struggle all the time. I always kind of make this joke, and I've said this to some of the operators at Lime in London. If I ever saw on the app a fully charged Lime bike in my neighborhood, I knew 100% that when I would get there, it would have no pedals
Right.
because the amount of vandalism and damage, or another one I would see all the time is if I saw a fully charged Lime bike on a canal path. London is full of these canals. It's usually the bike is in the canal. So as a completely reliable method of transportation, Lime is not. It's a good option if you need something quick, but for something to rely on, day to
Mm-hmm.
day, it's not going to be good enough. So that kind of led us to this idea that, look, people want to make this switch to e-bikes. People want to get out of their cars. There was a survey by McKinsey in 2024 that said 46% of Europeans would switch to an e-bike given the option to do so. So
Mm-hmm.
when we got here, based on research like that and conversations we had had just kind of anecdotally with people in Valencia, we started to dig deeper and say, okay, why aren't people switching to e-bikes? Like, what are the real reasons that they're not making that jump? And the first one was cost. So immediately people said to us, look, we can't afford 3 to 5,000 euro e-bike, which is the cost range for a high quality. If you're not buying something off of Timo or Alibaba, you're getting a quality product. It's going to be a few thousand euros. So that immediately led us down the path of subscription, which is something that's been going on for at least 10 years. You look at people like Swap Feets. Swap Feets has been subscribing bikes to people, since I think 2014. So that was an easy one for us, not reinventing the wheel there at all. The next thing that we were hearing from consumers was that there was this perception of inconvenience. And I say perception of inconvenience because people are usually pretty good about doing things like charging the battery. But they felt that if they didn't remember to charge the battery, or if they had a very long journey that they weren't going to be able to accomplish, that having an e-bike wasn't going to be a reliable or convenient way to get around. So we took an idea, again, as I did with Finn, from the Chinese market, and that's battery swapping.
Hmm.
And battery swapping is extremely popular there for cars, for e-bikes, for mopeds. And so we took a look at that. We took a look at the way they were approaching it, made some tweaks to kind of fit the European lifestyle and European infrastructure, to be honest. And then started telling people, look, now you using our app, you can have a subscription e-bike that you get for a low monthly cost. And anytime you need a fresh battery, literally anytime, you can use our app and swap in a fresh battery. And that allowed a lot of people to say, okay, this is actually a viable method of transportation now. And even for families, because we offer a family cargo bike as well. So it really allowed a large group of people within Valencia to say, okay, we can actually make this switch.
Right. It's much more user friendly and actually looking at the needs of users. That always makes a huge difference, right?
Yeah, 100%.
So Scott, then you have the idea, like you start building the product, and I know a lot of founders they focus on the product first for a long time, and then worry about marketing and communications later. You didn't do that. Like you started with marketing from the early days. Can you talk about that? Like why did you do that, and what are the things that you started out with?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, coming from a marketing and advertising background, I knew early on that we had to build a lifestyle brand here. We had to build a brand that customers and people wanted to associate themselves with, because ultimately there's utility. If you're not delivering a good product, it's just like Apple and Steve Jobs always said. If the product isn't great, the brand doesn't matter. But at the same time, if you have a great product and you don't tell anyone about it, I call it the field of dreams strategy. No one's going to find it. No matter how amazing it is, there's no point in creating something if you're not going to tell people about it. And so I think for us, we knew right away that brand building, particularly all of the elements that go along with that, logos, design, all of that was going to be super important, because we wanted people to be passionate, about our brand. And I think, when I was in advertising, I spoke a lot. And by the way, again, you guys have helped us with this tremendously. You can talk about brands. And if you think about, when you think about the word brand, it brings to mind this thing that gets kind of like burned into the back of a cow, right? It's a brand. So it's like kind of not a fun experience. But then you talk about icons, icons like Apple, like Tesla. Those are things you worship, right? Rather than a brand that gets burned onto your ass, you have an icon. And we wanted to become an icon. We wanted to become something that was ubiquitous with quality, was ubiquitous with ease of transportation, environmental sustainability. And we had to start having those conversations day zero. If you don't start from the beginning, you're just playing catch up,
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah. And how did you start out with marketing? I mean, I know, and this is kind of a funny story. You really don't like agencies, but we are working together now for quite a while, and like we love working with you and the other way around. So something happened there. Like, can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about kind of our journey. We were introduced by a potential investor, I think a Dutch guy, I can't remember.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and we started talking, and I said to you the first time we spoke, I was like, look, full disclosure, I hate agencies. I spent 10 plus years in the agency world, on the strategy side, on the account side, and you even see it on my LinkedIn occasionally. I kind of rant about agencies because I think, you know, typical agencies, like let's say McGarry Bowen had come to me, and I spent quite a bit of time at McGarry Bowen. If someone from McGarry had come to me and said, "Hey, we want to do marketing for you guys," I would have been like, "No fucking way. Absolutely not." Number one, bloated account teams, bloated strategy teams, bloated production teams, not interested. You don't add any value. You don't know anything about my industry. And I think that was the key for us, was like, this is a complex industry. There's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of players involved. There's a lot of layers. When I talk about what we do, I always say we're part of a transportation cocktail. And I think, again, having spent so much time in the agency space, part of the money that was wasted by engaging with an agency, that's not specific to an industry, was they have to get up to speed about your industry. And listen, if they're saying they're not billing you for that time, that's bullshit.
course.
you're going to pay for it some way or another. If during the pitch, you're going to pay for it afterwards. You will pay for that time. So again, our first conversation, I said, not a big fan of agencies, but the more we talked, the more I got the sense that you guys actually did know pretty much as there could be to know about mobility, electric mobility. And so it became evident, like, and another thing I always say to people is like, look, as a person with a marketing background, I'm going to be bad at marketing my own business because it's not going to be something that it's the shoemaker's shoes, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going
Yeah.
to want to spend the time. I'm not going to want to put the effort in. I'm going to do the bare minimum. So it wasn't something I wanted to do. I wanted to partner with someone. Well, at the time, I didn't want to partner with someone. We were going to do everything internally, but through a hire. And then speaking with you guys, it really became obvious again that you knew the industry and you knew what would appeal to people. And I think the only thing initially for us was that this is very much a consumer brand, and I wasn't 100% sure that you guys had the consumer chops to do what we needed to do. But I mean, you've blown us away. Like, obviously, again, from the start, you got to know what we were doing. You got to know the brand. There was never a question in my mind as to whether or not, I never had to explain anything. I never had, if I said an ICE car, it wasn't like, if I'm speaking to some
You
agency
mean,
hack
yeah.
at DDB, they're like, what the fuck is an ICE car? Like, and that's just wasting my time. It's wasting their time. It was nice to just like we could skip all the getting to know you bullshit and get straight to work, which is exactly what we did.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, Scott. I also don't like traditional agencies, so we're fully aligned there. And a lot of money goes to waste because, especially in our industry, they just don't know the industry. And it takes you like 6 to 12 months to fully understand what's going on. And as a startup, you don't have that time and you don't have the budget to pay for all that. So I can fully understand where you're coming from. Can we talk about like just going back to the early days with Clover? Like, how did you start out with marketing? Because you're already, like, the brand was already there. I know we adjusted some bits and pieces, but the foundation was there. There was already like a waiting list and things like that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about like what to do if you're an early stage startup, you want to start early on with marketing. What are the things you should focus on? Like what was your first step with Clover?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we really take a big step back, when a lot of the things that you see that are Clover now were legacy assets from one of my co-founders' prior businesses. He had a business in London called Clovertronics. It was all about building scooters and building e-bike batteries and things like that. But when we all came together to found what is now Clover, we took a look at what existed and said, okay, there's some good bones here, and there's some good parts of it. But like, for example, Clovertronics. Listen, I love Antonio, but it's a terrible name. Like, it's complicated. It doesn't translate to Spanish at all. Even when you take it to people in the US or UK, it's just kind of like it just seems like weird. It's kind of robotic. But there was something there. And when we started looking at other brands, not ironically, things like Apple, imagine if Apple was called like Appletronics, like how horrible that would be. But we saw that there was the root was there. And I think going back to kind of the stepping back from the brand building, I mean, in order for us to do what we are doing now and what preparing to launch and all of that, we had to have something that people could be interested in getting behind, right? So you talk about the waiting list, for example. Like, we had to have enough of a brand and enough of a communications and marketing strategy to get people excited about raising their hand and saying, "Hey, we're interested in what you're doing." And then I think on top of that, we need to build up that demand so that when we go to people like investors, and I said this to you from the very beginning, one of our biggest challenges in the beginning was something kind of silly, but it was important, which was our pitch deck. And when I sent you the first version of our pitch deck, that's outside of your website, that's the first experience that an investor is going to have with your brand. And it was okay, but I said it's doing the job. Again, handing it over to you guys, orders of magnitude of improvement. But I think going back to things like building a waiting list, starting those things early are super critical because it shows demand. And I think and traction, to be honest. And when you're looking at a startup like ours that's pre-revenue, pre-launch, back in 2021, 2020, 2019, you could raise for a startup that was pre-launch, pre-revenue based on just a very good idea. Nowadays, that's not the case. You absolutely must demonstrate traction. And to be honest, even wait lists are a little bit of a struggle.
Hmm.
These days, almost everyone is going to say, look, come back to me when you have revenue. But there are those believers that will invest pre-revenue, but they need something. And building demand and building a wait list like that, the only way to do that is with marketing. You can't do there is no magic bullet outside of maybe some viral content that you create on social media to create that kind of demand. And to be honest, even if you do have a viral moment, if you're a hardware business like ours, it's not going to do too much for you.
Yeah,
When you're
true.
looking at SaaS, sure, but for us, no, we needed to do, down and dirty demand generation marketing
Yeah.
from the start so that we had those signs of traction.
Yeah, absolutely. And the funny thing is, in the startup world, we always talk about building minimal viable products. And I also feel the same. I talk about this a lot with our startup clients. Like, you need to build a minimal viable marketing foundation, right? To do at least the minimum stuff you can do with your budget to make sure that you start out early. And it's not just building a brand, it's also, like you said, about investor marketing, making sure that your proposition is clear, it makes sense, it aligns with the market, it aligns with what investors are looking for. Turn that into a proper deck. And as we also experienced together, what I really liked is that, when you guys have so many meetings with potential investors, you come back with new ideas and things need to change. So it's not something you set up once and then you use it for a while. It changes all the time. And that's also, I was really happy that we could support you guys with that, because you want to make sure that it's always professional, it's always aligned with the brand and all of that, while it also has to convey the message that's most recent and that would work best with investors. So we worked a lot on that together. And now recently updating the website, also making it more aligned with what investors are looking for and the latest version of the deck. So that's how things change all the time. And that's also why I feel it's so important to work closely together. Like, you have a very nice team.
Absolutely.
It's like we're very well connected. And that's also why I'm happy. Like, in a long time ago, I also worked a lot with agencies, and I always thought, like, if I'm ever going to build an agency again, it's not going to be like this, because it's way too complex, way too much time is wasted, basically. And that's also what we're trying to do, like working very closely with you guys and also with our other clients to make sure that we're always there, we're doing the right thing at the right moment. And that's really working for Clover. And it sort of confirms what I always had in mind, like, hey, if this is kind of the kind of business I want to build. And yeah, with you guys, we can see it's working pretty well so far.
No, I think for us right now, the only limiting factor in engaging even more deeply with you guys is just budget, right? As a
Yeah.
startup, we have limited resources, but that's the other thing I'll say. I think to kind of echo what you just said, the bloated agency overhead model just doesn't exist with you guys. Like, and you're able to flex and adjust and revise and make better things as we need them. We move quick, and sometimes we move too quick, and we do things ourselves and then come back later and say, hey, actually we really need you guys to take a look at this. And no, I think one of the best things about working together has been that, you guys are on top of getting things, keeping them alive. All these are living documents, particularly the pitch deck. And then there was a moment where I think, it was maybe 2 months ago, an investor made a comment about our website. And it's one of these things, I'm so focused on fundraising, I don't even think about it. And I went and took a look, and it was like, woof, this is not connected to the messaging that we're conveying right now in our conversations with investors, which means that we're not conveying the right message to consumers either. So we said, hey, let's, we don't have a lot of budget, but let's see what we can do with the website with what we have. And I think it's again, orders of magnitude better than it was.
I remember that conversation. It's actually really nice to see where we are today, because a lot of times, like, agencies would advise you to build something new and it'll cost you a lot of money. While we said, okay, let's focus on what you have, provide us with access, and let's see what we can do within the current template and making some adjustments. And it worked out pretty well. And
Super well, super well. I mean, I think, look, the other thing is we're super scrappy on our side. Like, the great thing was, like, Valentina, your designer, she said, these are the assets I need, in order to make this site better. And these are the images, the videos, whatever. And we're able to just run out, create that content super quickly, super scrappy, and then feed that back to her. She turns it into the beautiful designs that you see now on our website. So I think it is that collaboration.
yeah,
I think that's key to making this work.
right. So, like, looking back at the other startups you founded, Cod, and also at Clover, what kind of advice would you give to startup founders in terms of marketing? Like, where should they start? Like, what should they be doing from the beginning?
One thing I would say is a lot of people get really bogged down in names and color schemes and all of that. And I wouldn't start with that. That to me is not a good starting place. And we went through this exercise of mission, vision, and values very early on in the process. We did it ourselves. It was before I met you. Otherwise, we would have done it together. But it's something I've done many, many times for many other brands. And so I think that is something that's super important
Mhm.
is aligning the mission and vision and values of what you're trying to do. Because I think that then informs everything you do, whether it's marketing, whether it's product design, software development. If it doesn't align with the mission, you know that I always have to kind of like, when I was in strategy and advertising, it's like regrounding the client on what these things actually are, right? So your vision is how you want the world to be after you've executed your mission, or as you're executing your mission. Your mission is what you're going to do to get the world to match your vision, and then your values are just that. They're how you behave and how you interact with the world. And so I think that's an early component that most startups need. I think they 100% neglect that. And I think, I'm lucky in that I had done that many times before with other brands, but most startup founders don't come from a marketing background, so they don't have that experience. So working with a partner to develop that, because it's super critical that it's grounded in the construct of mission, vision, and values. And people can get that super confused. They can mix up what's the mission, what's the vision. I think once you get that foundation built, then I think it's a lot easier to go and sit with creatives and talk about things like names and logos and websites and all of that, because you can judge all the creative that you have, all of the marketing that you do. You look at the mission and you say, is this helping us achieve our mission and our vision? And if you can say yes, then yeah, go for it. You're doing the right thing. But if you're doing something, if there's a marketing idea, and again, I think big agencies are notorious for this, they don't always attack the problem to be solved. They try to come up with a interesting creative execution. And for me, it was like, and even as we've been going along together in our journey, it's like we have to be focused on the mission and what problem we're trying to solve for consumers. And I think starting with a mission and vision and values, I think is a critical place for most startups, which is often neglected.
Right, right. Yes, we can see that too. Like founders are usually very technically driven people and working on a solution that they have in mind, but forgetting about kind of creating that story that will in the end like sell that product. But during their journey, also make sure that you get the awareness from investors that you need, that you get your message out there and people know what you're building. And that's also what I always say, even if you don't have any budget, at least get out there, like use LinkedIn to talk about what you're building and how things are going and all of that, because that already gives you some awareness that's helpful later on. And so that's definitely a good place to start.
Absolutely. But I would say on the point about budget, our budget is tiny right now, and we were essentially bootstrapping from the beginning. But I think something I would say to all startup founders is this is not an area to neglect. And you don't have to spend a lot of money to get a lot of value. You can be creative. Obviously, there's a lot of AI tools that can help amplify the things that agency partners might create for you. But in the case of something like a mobility startup, it's super important to start doing something as early as possible. And that's why, again, when Theo and I were first talking, it was really like, I said from the beginning, I'm like, we have no money. So what can we do with no money that at least gets us doing something? Because if you build again, I said it before, if you build an amazing product, you could have the best lamp in the world, but if you don't market it, no one's going to buy your lamp because no one knows about it. Ultimately, most startups succeed or fail based on sales and revenue. And whether that's, selling electricity through a DC fast charger or e-bike subscriptions, or, if people don't know you exist, you're not going to sell anything. And yeah, I think organic strategies can work to a certain extent. Again, it's the if you build it, they will come field of dreams strategy just doesn't work. I'm not saying you have to spend a lot. Eventually you might have to spend a lot, but in the beginning you should spend something. A lot of startup founders neglect this area massively. The other reason that we jumped in with you guys so early is because further down the road, we don't have to, post rationalize any of the things that we've done in the past, because we've had the strategic backbone the whole time. So whether or not we're laying deep on the execution right now, like, look, we don't have a big paid media budget right now, but I don't have to then go back and fix anything that I screwed up in the beginning, or post rationalize a strategy because I never had one in the first place. we've had you guys along for the ride from the beginning. And I'll give an example. Like we built a paid media strategy with you guys that we've never executed on because we haven't had the budget. But here's the thing. We built the strategy, right? All I have to do now is like, look, we tweak it a little bit for whatever stage we're at, whatever product we're offering now, and we're immediately ready to start that, up and running instantly. So
Yeah.
having that in our back pocket for when we do have the money, it's invaluable because you don't have to wait that probably took at least a month to develop that strategy. And now it's done. It'll need a week's worth of tweaks maybe, and we can hit the ground running. And I think as a startup founder, you can't neglect the value of that.
Yeah, I fully agree, Scott. Thanks for sharing that. What's next for Clover? And how does that impact your marketing? How are things going? Is there something you want to share on that part?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an interesting summer to say the least. We've been on a very long fundraising journey. At the same time we've been fundraising, we've been building the product. And I think again, testament to you guys. We've been working together as we're building the technology infrastructure, the foundations in marketing, the partnerships that we need on the supply side. So we've been spending a lot of time doing that. I think now there's some exciting things that I can't specifically share just because we haven't nailed down the details, but something exciting is going to happen in the fall here in Valencia. Our initial launch strategy, as many times in startups, totally changed because of a new opportunity. And that also meant that our marketing was going to have to change. We're going from a pure play kind of clean sheet marketing strategy now to, we have the opportunity to be able to market to people who maybe already have bought into the mission, but there's a new opportunity for them. And so now, rather than targeting totally net new people who don't know anything about subscription mobility, I came back to you guys in the team and said, hey, this is about to happen. We need to prepare ourselves to market to people who maybe have experienced subscription mobility in the past, and we're going to try to get them back with a much higher quality product. So I think obviously keep an eye out for what's coming next, obviously places like LinkedIn and Instagram, but we've got some big things happening. And in terms of marketing, again, it's a pivot in the strategy. I think it also, we're focused now on targeting our owned audiences more than paid, but there's just as much value in that. I think, Theo and I have talked about this before. It goes back to the waiting list, for example. When you have that owned marketing channels like email, like people who've subscribed to your LinkedIn and your Instagram, those drive a tremendous amount of value. And if you have new messages for those people, it performs amazingly. In the end, you will need paid marketing. I say this to everybody, and I keep banging this drum, on the podcast here. If you build it, they will come doesn't work. Like you are going to have to put paid media into this. You are going to have a marketing strategy. And so, yeah, you most likely in most cases, even if you are someone with an extensive marketing background like myself, you're going to need a partner to execute that.
Well, thanks for summarizing that, Scott. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's also like we already talked about, like have a look at the right support in marketing. Like your freelancer or an intern won't do the trick. Like you really need a team of specialists. And on the other hand, like a huge agency also doesn't help you because it becomes too big and too complex. So have a look and find the right partner and make sure that you start running your marketing from day one. It's also like we're setting things up together. Like the budget will increase, and as will our corporation. So I think it's a great way of working together. And also from the agency perspective, or I always prefer to call ourselves like a marketing team for our clients. But from that perspective, like it's also good for us to be involved from day one because we can help you prevent making mistakes that will influence things later on. So if we do it right from the beginning, it makes a huge difference. And I think the Clover journey so far is a good example of that.
Well, and I think just to add to that, like, again, back to the team, we have Valentina as our designer, Barry is our copywriter. They've developed a language, Barry literally a language around the brand, how we talk. We've collaborated together on that, but he's really set the tone, set the approach, set the, we're a fun brand. We're trying to be a fun brand, I should say, but we're very tongue in cheek. We're very, we're a little bit sarcastic. We're a little bit, as the Brits would say, cheeky. And I think Barry has crafted that from the beginning in collaboration with us, of course, but that's a voice that, you can't do that yourself, And then in terms of the design aesthetic, we went to you guys and said, let's be really bold. We want to be elegant in the same way that Apple is, but we also I think we're maybe a little less serious than Apple. And I think, again, giving that brief to your team and having them, and again, Anna Maria kind of wrangling the whole thing together, like it is 100% the team. And then I'll say, again, we're talking now, so I'm not trying to pat you on the back, but having Theo leading the whole thing, keeping it all together, being the kind of cohesive connector. And when we talk about you, we talk about you as our fractional CMO. And I think that adds a tremendous amount of credibility with investors. I think in the past, there was this big stigma with startups of hiring agencies and hiring fractional CFOs and all of that. And when I came into this time around for fundraising purposes, particularly, everything is leveled up, not just one level, maybe 10 levels. So you have to come in with a much higher level of credibility. Your numbers have to be perfect. You have to have a go-to-market strategy that's bulletproof. And again, for most startups, they're not going to have those kinds of resources internally. And whether or not we had a go-to-market resource internally or not, it's not the main thing that I'm focused on as the co-founder.
Yeah.
So having those resources outside, we have a fractional CFO, we have a fractional CMO in you, and those things have become critically important in the fundraising process too, not just the ongoing execution of the business.
It's also showing professionality, right? Showing that you are serious with this, that you're doing the right thing. That's also what gets investors across. Yeah, definitely.
100%.
So Scott, anything you want to add? I think we talked about most of the journey, and I really appreciate you talking highly about us. It's great to be working with you guys, and I hope for our audience, it also became clear that marketing is something important from the get-go, and it's not a luxury, but it's something you definitely need in your foundation because it will help you further on in your journey. So thanks for being here, Scott.
The only thing I would say is anyone who's questioning whether or not this is a good value, call me. We're super happy with everything you guys have done for us. We're excited to continue the relationship. No end in sight here. We're very happy to be working together. So anyone who has any questions, I say this to Theo all the time. If you need a reference, call me. I'm happy to say good things.
Great. Thanks for that, Scott. And if you're listening into this podcast today, if you enjoyed the conversation, subscribe to the eMobility Marketing Podcast on your favorite platform and connect with me on LinkedIn for more strategies and founder stories. And if you want to hear more about Clover, feel free to connect with Scott. I'm sure that you will find him on LinkedIn and he'll be happy to speak with you. So again, Scott, thanks for being here. I really enjoyed our conversation. And to the audience, I'll see you again in our next episode. Thank you.
Awesome.